No. That's cool.
So we're here in Shinsaibashi, Osaka, and if I don't look like I'm in the happiest of moods, is because I absolutely dislike this area. I regard it as the Times Square of Osaka. It's flooded with tourists and it's dirty, it's crowded, and frankly, I just don't see what's so special about this area. Many tourists do come here for the famous Glico running man or marathon man, whatever you want to call him. That poster or that billboard has been in Osaka for decades, so it is quite a landmark and an attraction for Osaka. But the point is this is really where the honeymoon ends as an expat in Japan, mainly because you have so many tourists here and I blend in to Japanese. They don't know that I am a long-term resident here. And they don't know that I know many of the local customs and I'm accustomed to everyday life and the various norms here. So I just blend in like all of the other tourists who come here to Japan. And of course, not to take away from any tourist experience, it's a big highlight to come to Japan. If you're from the West, obviously it's quite a long trip, and it's been on the list of many people for years to come to Japan, and for various reasons, whether that's culture or food. There's obviously, there are things that Japan is known for, like anime and manga, but it's, in my opinion, the really sort of hard realities of being here as well is that you, no matter how long you're here, no matter how well you know the local customs or the language, you are never fully integrated into Japanese culture. There are so few foreigners here, and there's not this sort of broad recognition or acceptance by many Japanese of foreign presence and the, I guess, experience that we have living here day to day. You just sort of are a gaikokujin, that's the Japanese term for a foreigner. So you'll hear some people say, and many of them have been here long term, that you follow the rules and do your best to really adhere to the principles or the norms or the behaviors of Japanese. And I do agree. I think that any foreigner, when you're living in a society, you should do your best to be a complementary part of that society, a contributor to that society. But at the same time, and perhaps I'm maybe speaking or painting a broad stroke about Japan, is because it's such a homogenous culture, because there are so few foreigners, because of the challenges for foreigners living here, we'll never be Japanese, no matter how much effort or attention that we put into adhering to the norms, the acceptance of many of the pillars that define Japanese culture, and then also just how much we try to integrate into Japanese culture. And so, again, as I said, I do believe in that, but I do believe where a lot of the thinking is misplaced for many foreigners, particularly long-term foreigners, is yes, you've been here a long time, several years like me, 6 years, or decades. I know people have been here 2 decades, 3 decades, and generally for those individuals, the theme that I've found is that there is this, I guess, sort of deference, there's this resignation to trying to be Japanese. And I think there's this bigger kind of loss of one's own identity because, again, as I said previously, we're not, and we can't be, and we'll never be. We look different, we come from a different place, we communicate differently, and many of our values are different. And so I always draw a hard line about that, and it doesn't mean I'm a rebel or that I'm sort of, what's the word, I reject any rules. Obviously, I do have my own point of view. I do act independently. I do act in what I believe are my best interests. And obviously, without trampling on the perspective or the domains of others. And then there are individuals who maybe haven't been here that long and they're relatively new, and their reason for being are very novel. So they've watched Japanese anime for several years, and it's always been their dream to come to Japan and be part of it and experience all the unique things that I think many people know Japan for. But there are the hard realities. There's your life living day to day. There's your professional life. There's your upward mobility in terms of job opportunities and such. So there are lots of things that I think many people don't account for. And so I'll give you an example. There was one young lady, she's in her early 30s and very, I think, extroverted personality and very attuned to Japanese culture, at least, some of the symbolic elements, as I mentioned earlier, the manga, the anime. But she was going to be working professional assignment, and that assignment involved working with some Japanese professionals, all male, for business coaching, a lot like the work that I do. And she asked me if I had any advice. And I told her, I said, well, you must establish yourself as the authority immediately, because this is Japan, this is their country, their world, it is their reference. And so a lot of the norms, that's what they are going to demonstrate to you. And those things, because you're a newcomer or you haven't been here a long time, those are going to be some real challenges or friction points. And so that was the key thing, because I've experienced that as well in my experience here. And she didn't last 2 sessions in that work assignment. It just was too overwhelming to her to be a female. And of course it could apply to foreigners as well, among a group of Japanese professionals, particularly males, and being able to maintain your professionalism, maintain your leadership or authority, your direction for this group as it relates to coaching them and teaching them. And so these are where it gets these are areas or examples where it gets very real, where you do have to understand where you are and what you're dealing with and how to deal with it tactfully, professionally, and then obviously within cultural frameworks, intercultural frameworks. And so these are just some of the things that I wanted to highlight in terms of the realities of being here. And again, I don't have a problem with living here day to day, but again, over the long term, the next 5, 10, 20 years, is it something that you can make peace with? Or do you operate in a shell outside of the culture? And I've met many individuals who do operate that way. They have no contact with Japanese in a meaningful level day to day, whether it's work or personal life in their communities and so on. And so you're operating as in a shell. And is that something that's tolerable in your day to day or over the long term? Is your life full? Is it have the variety, the depth that you might have in your own place, or even other places where there is commonality, Western countries, for example? Now, I know why many of these individuals have it. Many of them came to Japan in their early 20s, and so their whole reference is from that point when they were really developing personally or maybe even professionally. And so there's really no sort of external influences that these individuals had that would give them a broader perspective, whether they've grown up into adulthood in their own countries or whether they've traveled and experienced other cultures. Their reference is purely Japanese, and I don't think that that's always good. I do think that there is something to be said for developing in a multitude of ways, and you don't really get that here in Japan because, again, it's such a homogenous culture. There are not a large amount of external influences here. So I understand the reference from the long-term expats here. I would say to answer that, where you can be a complement to Japanese culture, but then also be your true self, is recognizing what you can contribute. And that's, I think, the differences that you bring, the capabilities and skills that one brings that are very different from what most Japanese have. I think it's more helpful to bring those attributes, those elements, than to simply conform to the Japanese way of being. And I don't think it's helpful broadly to Japanese and Japanese society to be conformist when you are a gaikokujin, a foreigner. But I think there is more help to sort of understanding the nuances of the culture, navigating the intricacies of the culture, and introducing things that can be beneficial, one within the culture, Japanese culture, but then also as it relates to intercultural exchange. So that's really the point that I wanted to highlight here is why I think Shinsaibashi is so symbolic, because again, this is very much a tourist zone. I think many tourists don't really get sort of an in or really immersed into Japanese culture. What are you going to do? So you came to buy, some cosmetic items, some candies, some clothing items at a bargain because the currency is favorable from wherever you're from. Is that really what we define as experience? And then also things like valuing, in Japanese culture, they value the group over the individual. And that's very difficult for Westerners, where it's a very individualistic society. People think and function independently oftentimes. And so that's a very hard adjustment to make here in Japan. And maybe one that someone like myself, who's in my late 40s and has been to other parts of the world, has had several personal and professional experiences. How do you just make a hard shift to valuing the group over the individual? And it doesn't mean that the group is unimportant, but when the default reference is the group over the individual, certainly that's going to create some challenges, some friction, some missteps, miscues, those sorts of things. And so these are the types of things that, when it comes to whether being an expat in Japan is all that it's cracked up to be, these are some real considerations. And as I go forward, I've been here several years, can I make peace with that? Can I reconcile those things? So those are the things that really require some thought and attention about being here. And yeah, it's definitely something that I think about day to day. And my mother used to say to me, wherever you go, there you are. And I used to hate when she said that to me, because I never know what it meant, or never knew what it meant. And as I get older, it becomes more clear what it is that she means. You are who you are. It doesn't matter where you go, whether you go to the next zip code in your local town, or whether you come all the way across the world in a place like Japan. Who you are is who you are. And so, yes, again, you can adapt yourself under certain conditions and in certain situations, but can you really abandon those things that you value, the principles that you hold, the things that you were raised with? So as an expat, there are some things that are pretty key considerations in terms of one's own longevity here and ability to function here with a reasonable degree of balance. And so I'm going to cover those. So number one, professional life. And so generally, good professional opportunities are very limited for foreigners, and there are reasons for that. One, obviously Japan work culture is very different than many other cultures around the world. And so Japanese work very long hours, and compensation isn't that great, especially relative to other countries. And that's been consistently documented about Japanese work culture. So as a foreigner, one, you're dealing with that because primarily Japan is a seniority-based system as it relates to its workforce. That's an extension of patriarchal societies and hierarchical societies, where generally in the West it's a flat sort of or sort of less tiered sort of structure. So if you are a skilled and experienced foreigner, for example, that doesn't translate in terms of your professional opportunities or outlook here in Japan. And so generally the person who has been at the company the longest or the oldest has seniority, and that is the case whether this person has skills and relevant experience and obviously successes under his or her belt. And so if you take someone who might have all those things, younger, less experience or less time at the company, but milestones, talent, skills, successes, that doesn't necessarily translate into upward mobility in a Japanese work structure. And then also your skills and talents also don't translate to higher compensation. And so for a foreigner seeking professional opportunities with upward mobility and reasonable compensation for his or her skills, that could really sort of lead to some disappointment. So Japan is a risk-averse culture, and so that translates to the workplace as well, where again, in the group-oriented approach, consensus-driven, there isn't the willingness to take risks. There isn't the general leanings toward the individual making a decision and setting the direction, much the way there is in the West. And so for a foreigner, that can be problematic because decision making can be quite slow, or it may not be the optimal decision. And so those are some things to be mindful of. But it's not just how a foreigner might view Japan. Also, there is strong recognition among Japanese companies and human resources that it is very difficult to integrate foreigners into Japanese work environments because of these differences and because there may be some issues with harmony or with the style or the approach to work decision making, presenting ideas, and so on. The other thing to think about the practical aspects is obviously healthcare in Japan. And so the quality of healthcare in Japan is regarded as very good, and it is from my own experiences. However, as a foreigner, that doesn't always translate 100%, and that's because some practitioners, medical practitioners, are not comfortable with foreigners, and there are a few reasons, either just lack of familiarity due to lack of international exposure, or language barrier. And I've run into those things, and it's very clear where you can see that the experience is going to be suboptimal. However, because I live in a big city in Japan, Osaka, and there's also Tokyo, you have the luxury of choice. There are plenty of doctors who are specialized, who do speak English and do have international experience, and that's the case for my doctor. And so that's fine in these types of environments, but if you're an expat living in the countryside, for example, it's probably more frequent than not that the local doctor may not have that type of experience or the ability to communicate with foreign patients. But even living here in Japan, there are just things here, living in the big city in Osaka, for example, as a middle-aged man, concerns about health and sort of aspects of aging to consider that I think normally in the West we would have conversations with our doctors about, or our doctors would initiate the conversation with us. So for example, let's say sexual health. Obviously, it's very common for men in their 40s and 50s to experience sexual dysfunction and present those issues to a doctor. The doctor asks questions and hopefully there's some remedies. But here in Japan, that's not the case. Sex is a very taboo subject here in Japan. So as it relates to sexual issues, function, for example, that's a very difficult conversation to have with one's doctor because of the taboo nature of it. And I think it's interesting for me because, not as a foreigner, but I'm sure there are many men, Japanese men, who are of a similar profile, middle age, and aging concerns, health concerns, who do have some issues with their health function, particularly sexual health function. So how do they address these issues with their doctor? Or are there people walking around with these issues who are not bringing them to the surface? And how are they coping with those things? What outlets are they seeking? So that's a very real consideration as it relates to being an expat. And then the one that I think probably is universal to everyone, and that's relationships. So in Japan, culturally, many Japanese work long hours, and so there isn't a lot of time for social interactions. And if it's not the long hours, then it's the income, the amount of money to be able to do various things. And so there isn't a large amount of disposable income for many Japanese, so that really restricts the opportunities for social outlets. But then there's also the nuance of the culture as well. Many Japanese don't want to burden others, and so if someone's feeling lonely or if they want to do something, they want connection, generally there is an aversion to reaching out to people and saying, hey, let's go out, I'm feeling stressed, I've got work issues, family issues, these types of things. And so generally the approach is to keep it to oneself. And if it's not that, then it's just very transactional in nature because everyone's so busy. There are sort of the milestone opportunities. So again, going out with coworkers after work is quite common in Japan, or when there are opportunities in one's schedule, and that can be planned out, and that could be weeks or months in advance that you're going to meet someone for a social interaction. So it's not as fluid as it might be in Western culture. And let me take that back, not so much fluid, not as spontaneous oftentimes as it might be in Western culture, where, hey, what are you doing tonight? Do you want to meet up for a drink, or do you want to meet up for dinner? Or it's the end of the week, hey, what do you have going on this weekend? Do you want to do something? It's not like that here. And so that can be quite problematic if someone really values social connections and values them consistently. I think even for an extroverted personality, if those things are lacking, perhaps that can be quite challenging in terms of finding those types of things that people really value in terms of the relationships and those interactions. And so I think it's a very sort of interesting dynamic, for those who may have extroverted personalities and how that works. And then again, some also come to Japan, not extroverts, but some foreigners come to Japan because of the things that they identify with about Japan. Maybe the manga or the anime, for example, or the fashion or music and these sorts of things. And so what happens when that novelty wears off? What are you left with? Do you really have something substantive, something that brings balance to your presence here or your existence here? And then there are the introverts, and I would put myself in that category. I think for me, and not speaking for all introverts, Japan works well for me because I don't value those social interactions and those human connections, and I don't need them frequently or even occasionally. I came here all the way from the US, leaving family and friends behind. And so obviously I'm okay in terms of functioning on my own or not knowing when I might have those opportunities for social interactions. So it works well for me, and I have the various things that I think bring me balance in terms of my own hobbies and interests. And so I think Japan works well in that regard for such personality types. Whether you're in the countryside or you are in the big city, there are always going to be things to deal with. So adjustments are part of expat life. It's not the way we grew up, or it's not sort of the norms that we've become accustomed to in terms of how things work. And so those are some real things to be mindful of. I can tell you some of the frustrations for me, even 6 years in. One's banking here. Japan has a very antiquated banking system, and there are reasons for that. It's by design, and then there are some cultural limitations that contribute to it. And for example, many people are still using bank books, like the paper books, to transact and withdraw money and also deposit money. There are still cash cards, and those cards are not set up for online transactions or digital transactions. And then there are even the day-to-day things that can be quite frustrating. So for example, automatic withdrawal for products and services. So for example, it took me 10 months to get automatic withdrawal set up for my rent payment. And that required multiple conversations with the bank and my apartment management company. I had to go to the bank and bring my hanko, which is my seal with my signature, to the bank and stamp it on a piece of paper in front of the staff member so that automatic withdrawal of my rent payments could be initiated. To see how things work in America, where there are digital wallets and online payments for everything, and instant deposits, for example, those things don't really exist here to that degree, or are still lacking in many ways. And the banking system is also built around seniority, mainly or namely the elderly. And so it is built for high trust so that it is understood where the money is and where the money goes. And so cash is still highly valued here in Japan. And so there hasn't been this transition to really digital banking at the degree that we know in the West, and maybe even some other Asian countries like Singapore and China, for example, South Korea. So obviously, as I've outlined, there's some challenges, but that's going to be with anything, whether it's here or whether it's stateside. There's going to be challenges. It's really the context. I'm often asked, do I have plans to return stateside? And the answer is no. And it's not that Japan is some utopia, it's far from it. But as I talked about in my previous video, when I returned from traveling the world and some of the culture shock, reverse culture shock of coming back to the States, I just realized that it wasn't the place for me. I felt like a misfit. But the other component to it is really the U.S. itself. Fundamentally, it's still very much a hotbed of racism centuries into its existence. And so for Black people, people of color, they're still very much impacted by that and have to navigate that in their daily lives. And whether that's personal interactions or whether it's professional situations, there are things to deal with as people of color, as Black people. And I've just decided that that's not what I want the framework of my life to be, or at least a component of my life to be, broadly, and whether that's here in Japan or whether that's in the US. So there are lots of things that I just have decided that I will not continue to accept generationally, or even just who I am as an individual, or even as a Black person or a Black man. And so that's just a hard line for me. Now, that's not to say that there isn't some sort of racism or discrimination in Japan. The key thing is that I understand what it is. I am a foreigner. I am different. I am not Japanese. And so it's very clear cut, and I understand sort of how that presents challenges and limitations as well. But at least I understand sort of the foundation of it, a very homogenous society. And perhaps with the integration of more foreigners, that does become more of a present issue. But as it stands now, I think my existence here in Japan, I'm much more comfortable with this. Do I see a future? Do I see longevity in Japan? Yes, absolutely. It will come with challenges. It will come with compromises, and that's just the fact of it. I would say there are a couple of ways to overcome that. Obviously, being able to speak the language, being able to communicate is a huge, huge asset in order to be able to make one's life full and comfortable here. There's a very different sort of reception among Japanese when you can speak the language, when you can communicate on their terms, and also project some of those cultural elements that are comfortable and familiar with them. But also, Japan is a base. And so, as I mentioned, some of the limitations and constraints professionally, that doesn't mean that I am, or I have to be limited by the opportunities or my growth here, either personally or professionally. Certainly there are opportunities around the world, and I can use Japan as my base and follow those opportunities, and also be able to create and deliver from right here, right where I'm having this conversation with you. So that's my perspective on being an expat in Japan. Obviously, my perspective is just one of many. I'm sure there are varying perspectives. Some may be wildly different than mine, but I just thought I'd share with you my own experience and how I look at my life and life here in Japan. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one soon.